Marcus. And that is exactly why you are still hurting, and why you are still waking up at 3 in the morning covered in a cold sweat. You think the pain is a theological signal? You think the grief is a cosmic warning that you made a massive, unforgivable mistake. You left, and now you are suffering, so your brain tells you that you must have walked away from the absolute truth. Adam. Because that is what we were always taught, from the time we were children sitting in Sunday school coloring pictures of Noah's Ark. If you leave the truth, you lose your peace. It is a direct cause and effect, an unbreakable spiritual law. The grief is proof that I stepped out of the light and into the darkness. The absolute, crushing weight of this isolation. The fact that I feel like a ghost in my own life right now. It all points to one undeniable conclusion. I was wrong to leave. I made a mistake, and this agony is God calling me back or punishing me for my rebellion. Marcus. No. It points to something completely different. The grief is proof that you are human. The pain has absolutely nothing to do with theology. It is structural. It is profoundly psychological. And it has a clinical name. Adam. A clinical name? So now we are medicalizing a crisis of faith? We are taking a deep, spiritual problem, a crisis of the soul, and turning it into a textbook psychological disorder just to make ourselves feel better about walking away? Howard. We are not medicalizing anything. We are finally being honest about what actually happens to the human brain and the human heart when you lose your entire world overnight. Because I have been exactly where you are sitting right now, and I know the exact, bitter flavor of that specific grief. Howard. Before we continue this conversation, if this kind of content speaks directly to what you are going through in the quiet moments of your day, subscribing makes sure the algorithm sends you more, because this conversation is going to get much more intense in a few minutes, and we have a lot of layers to peel back. If you are feeling that isolation, stick around because you are going to want to hear the rest of this. Howard. I remember the exact moment it hit me with its full, devastating force. I had been a deacon for 22 years at my Southern Baptist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. 22 years of my life. 22 years of unlocking the heavy wooden doors on Sunday mornings, smelling the old hymn books, shaking hands in the foyer, knowing everyone's family history. 22 years of Wednesday night suppers, of knowing exactly where I belonged in the universe. After my wife passed away, the silence in my house became absolutely unbearable. It was a suffocating quiet. So I started reading the Bible again, searching desperately for some kind of comfort. I was desperate for the absolute certainty that I would see her again in heaven. That was the only thought that kept me going. And instead of comfort, I found the contradictions. Howard. I found a copy of a book by a philosopher named Spinoza at a dusty garage sale in East Tennessee. I bought it for 50 cents, not knowing it was going to completely dismantle my entire reality. I spent an entire summer hiding in the Knoxville Public Library, cross-referencing Spinoza with modern biblical academia. The afternoon I finally realized, truly realized, that the first 2 chapters of Genesis were written by entirely different authors with entirely different political agendas. 50 years of deeply held faith completely unraveled. It did not snap. It unraveled thread by thread until there was absolutely nothing left to hold on to. Adam. And that is the moment you felt free? Because everyone online, everyone who talks about deconstruction and leaving the church, says it is this beautiful, empowering liberation. You open your eyes, and suddenly you are free from the dogma, and you can just breathe. Howard. Liberation? No, I did not feel liberated. I felt like I was in free fall without a parachute. The worst part was not losing the theological doctrine. The worst part came on a Tuesday morning about a month later. I was driving to the hardware store, and I drove past the church building. Our church building. The parking lot was completely empty. There was a beam of morning sunlight hitting the stained glass window on the east side of the sanctuary, right exactly where my wife and I used to sit every single Sunday for decades. And looking at that window, I felt a physical, agonizing pain in my chest. A crushing, suffocating grief that made me pull the car over to the side of the road. I had lost the only physical place on earth where her memory still felt alive and present to me. I had lost the entire community that held me together when she died. I lost the people who brought food to my house when I could not get out of bed. Adam, see, that is exactly what I am talking about. That exact, specific grief. I feel it too, every single day. And every time I feel it, every time that wave of sadness hits me out of nowhere, I think, maybe I was just arrogant. Maybe I should just go back, apologize to the pastor, sit in the back pew, and pretend. The guilt is absolutely overwhelming. I left. I made the conscious choice to walk away from the community. I should feel free. I should feel like a massive weight has been lifted off my shoulders. Why do I feel like I am mourning a death? Why do I feel this deep, bleeding wound of disconnection? I was the Sunday school teacher. I was the one everyone called when they needed prayer. My entire identity was wrapped up in being the faithful one. Who am I now? Am I just spiritually weak for feeling this much loss? Marcus, you are not spiritually weak. You are someone who is actively mourning the death of an identity, but you are interpreting the mourning as a moral failure. You are reading the pain as a sign that the doctrine was true. Let us look at the historical evidence. Let us look at people who have walked this exact path on a massive scale. Have you ever heard of a writer named Karen Armstrong? Adam, the author? The one who writes those massive history books about world religions and God? Marcus. Yes. In 2004, she published a memoir called The Spiral Staircase. But long before she was a world-renowned, highly respected scholar, she was a Catholic nun. She spent 7 entire years in a convent. 7 years of rigorous, structured, absolute devotion. She wore the habit. She took the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. She gave up her entire individual identity for the collective identity of the order. But eventually, the cognitive dissonance became far too much to bear. In 1969, she made the agonizing, terrifying decision to leave. She walked away from the order entirely, stepping out into a modern world she barely recognized. And do you know what happened to her next? Adam, let me guess. The secular world embraced her with open arms. She wrote her books, and she found immediate peace, clarity, and liberation from the oppressive dogmas of her past. She felt amazing. Marcus. Exactly the opposite. She spent nearly an entire decade in profound, debilitating depression, complete and utter disorientation. She described losing her religious community not as a joyful liberation, but as falling apart, literally disintegrating. Her entire social structure, her daily rituals, her defined purpose, the very rhythm of her days from morning prayers to evening vespers, all of it was gone in an instant. She was completely adrift in a world she did not understand, carrying a grief so heavy it almost crushed her. Adam, which proves my point entirely. She left and she lost her peace. She fell apart. The system works exactly as advertised by the church. When you leave the fold, you suffer. The grief is the direct consequence of the rebellion. The pain is the price you pay for walking away from the truth. Howard, wait. Do not stop the story there. You are looking at the pain and automatically assuming it means she made a massive mistake. You are assuming the grief validates the theology she left behind. But after that decade of agonizing grief, after years of feeling completely lost and broken. Did she go back to the convent? Did she return to the Catholic doctrine and beg for readmission because the outside world was too painful? Adam, I do not know. Did she? Howard. No, she did not. She went on to write 12 major books on comparative religion. She became one of the most respected spiritual scholars of our time. Her intellect flourished. Her understanding of humanity and history deepened immensely. The grief did not prove that the Catholic doctrine she left was the absolute, unquestionable truth. The grief proved that belonging, ritual, and community are deeply embedded, non-negotiable human needs. Marcus. Exactly. You can genuinely grieve the loss of something that it was also absolutely necessary to leave. The two realities are not mutually exclusive. The pain of the amputation does not mean the limb was not deeply infected. You are mourning the loss of the community, the loss of the structure, not the loss of the dogma. But the Church intentionally conflates the two, making you think that missing the people means you miss the theology. Adam. Okay, I understand the metaphor. I understand that major life transitions are hard. But this is not just a hard transition like changing jobs or moving to a new city. This feels like I am losing my mind. When I am sitting in that grief, it does not feel like a normal adjustment period. It feels like a panic attack. It feels like a physiological crisis. I get sweaty palms just thinking about running into someone from my old small group at the grocery store. I feel a knot in my stomach every Sunday morning. Marcus. And that brings us to 1993. A clinical psychologist named Marlene Winell published a groundbreaking, incredibly important book called Leaving the Fold. She was a former fundamentalist herself. She knew the language, she knew the culture, she knew the subtle manipulations, and most importantly, she knew the exit wounds. And she was the very first clinician to look at this specific pattern of grief, this specific type of physiological panic, and give it a clinical name. Adam. What did she call it? Marcus Religious Trauma Syndrome. Adam Religious Trauma Syndrome? Come on, that sounds like a perfectly crafted made-up excuse to pathologize belief. It sounds like a buzzword people use to justify their rebellion against God and avoid taking personal responsibility for their own spiritual failures. Is that even a real medical diagnosis? It is not in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is it? Marcus, you are right. It is not a standalone diagnosis in the DSM. But do you know what is recognized in the International Classification of Diseases published by the World Health Organization? Adam. What? Marcus. Complex PTSD, and the exact cluster of symptoms that Marlene Winell identified under religious trauma syndrome are routinely and consistently treated by licensed therapists today as complex PTSD. Howard. We are talking about severe cognitive confusion, extreme debilitating isolation, a complete loss of identity that leaves you staring at the mirror not knowing who is looking back. Guilt spirals that keep you awake for days, replaying every theological argument in your head. Panic attacks when simply walking past a church building or unexpectedly hearing a certain hymn playing softly in a waiting room. Marcus Marlene Winell compared religious trauma syndrome to metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is not a single disease you can point to in a textbook. It is a recognized, observable, and highly treatable cluster of symptoms caused by identifiable underlying conditions. Religious trauma syndrome is the exact same thing. It is a clinical reality, a physiological response to a high-control environment, not a theological misstep. Adam. But a trauma syndrome? From going to church? That is a massive, incredibly aggressive claim. We are talking about communities that bring casseroles when you are sick, communities that sing beautiful hymns on Sunday mornings, communities that organize youth group car washes and bake sales. We are not talking about war zones. We are talking about potluck dinners and Bible studies. How can that cause complex PTSD? Marcus: For you, it was singing hymns and potluck dinners. But what happens when the underlying message every single Sunday, woven into every single hymn, every sermon, and every casual conversation, is that you are inherently broken? What happens when the community's love, the casseroles, and the support are entirely 100% conditional on your strict theological conformity? Howard: I saw it happen in my own congregation in East Tennessee. For 22 years, I watched it play out time and time again. The moment someone started asking the wrong questions, the moment someone expressed a sincere doubt about biblical inerrancy or a specific political stance endorsed by the pulpit, the warmth evaporated instantly. The casseroles stopped coming. The dinner invitations disappeared. The community closed its ranks with terrifying speed. You go from being a beloved pillar of the community to a dangerous cautionary tale in a matter of weeks. The love was never unconditional. It was a transaction. Marcus: And when you finally leave, when you step outside that protective bubble, your brain is absolutely terrified, because from a purely evolutionary standpoint, being cast out of the tribe means literal death. A human being alone in the wilderness does not survive. Your nervous system is not reacting to a high-level theological disagreement about the age of the earth or the authorship of Genesis. Your nervous system is reacting to a perceived imminent threat to your fundamental survival. That is why the grief feels so violent. That is why your hands shake. Your amygdala is screaming that you are going to die because you are alone. Adam, I need to pause, because this is uncomfortable. I want to argue against this. I really do. I want to defend the people I left behind. But I cannot deny the physical symptoms you just described. I cannot deny the panic attacks, the waking up in a cold sweat, terrified that hell might actually be real. But even if it is trauma, even if it is an evolutionary fear of exile, why does it last so long? Why does the isolation feel so incredibly permanent? Nobody around me understands what I am going through. My family keeps asking when I am coming back, when I am going to get over this phase. I feel like an absolute outsider in my own hometown. Howard: Because you are an outsider now, and that silence, that gray, agonizing period of complete isolation, it is not an accident. It has been mapped. It has been studied extensively. Have you ever read the work of James Fowler? Adam: No. Who is James Fowler? Marcus: A brilliant developmental psychologist at the Harvard Divinity School. In 1981, he published a massive psychological model called the Stages of Faith. And this is where the entire conversation changes level. This is where we stop talking about theology and start talking about human development. Adam: How does it change? What did he find that is so groundbreaking? Marcus Fowler mapped how human beings psychologically develop in their belief systems over a lifetime. He identified several distinct stages of cognitive and spiritual maturity. Stage 3 is what he called synthetic conventional faith. That is inherited faith. In stage 3, your entire identity is completely and totally based on your community. You believe what the group believes, you value what the group values, and the group gives you your sense of self. You do not have an independent theological framework. You have the group's framework. Adam: Which is exactly what most churches are built to be. An ecosystem of shared belief where everyone reinforces everyone else. Howard: Exactly. And most of us spend our entire lives comfortably resting in stage 3. It is incredibly comfortable. It is safe. You know exactly who you are. You know exactly what the rules are. You know exactly who your enemies are. And you know exactly what happens after you die. The world makes perfect, absolute sense. There is no ambiguity. Marcus: But then, something happens. A rupture. a contradiction you can no longer ignore, like Howard finding that Spinoza book, a trauma the church mishandles, or a piece of historical evidence that completely shatters the paradigm, and you are forced, often kicking and screaming against your will, into stage 4. Individuative reflective faith. In stage 4, you have to critically examine your personal beliefs and build an identity entirely outside of the group's validation. You have to decide what is actually true, not just what is acceptable to the tribe. Adam. And the transition between stage 3 and stage 4, that is what causes the grief. The process of individuation? Marcus. It does not just cause grief. Fowler found that moving from stage 3 to stage 4 almost always involves intense grief, extreme disorientation, and a profound, shattering crisis of meaning. It is a psychological earthquake. Howard. Think about the magnitude of what that means for you right now, sitting in this isolation. The grief you are feeling is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is not a sign that you are a bad person or a backslider. It is the normal, expected, scientifically documented cost of developing a genuinely examined faith. It is structurally inevitable. You cannot grow into a mature, independent adult without leaving the safety of the childhood home. Adam. Structurally inevitable. Marcus. Yes. Structurally inevitable. You are not just leaving behind a set of abstract theological propositions about the afterlife or ancient history. You are leaving behind an entire identity. You are leaving behind the person you used to be. The architecture of your reality is collapsing. Of course you are grieving. If you were not grieving, it would mean the community never actually mattered to you in the first place. Howard, remember what you said at the very beginning of this conversation? Adam. What did I say? Howard, you said the grief is proof that I stepped out of the light. Marcus. Exactly. Everyone learns that. Everyone is taught that from the pulpit. And that is exactly the function of that narrative. Not to inform you, to control you. They frame the natural psychological pain of individuation as a divine punishment for leaving. They take a normal human developmental crisis, a necessary step in human maturity, and they weaponize it to pull you back in through fear. They tell you that your growing pains are actually the flames of hell licking at your heels. Adam, Adam, I came into this conversation thinking I knew exactly why I was hurting. I thought I was fundamentally broken. I thought God was actively punishing me for asking too many questions and reading the wrong books. I do not have a good answer for this. Honestly, I do not have any way to refute this, and I do not want to try to refute it anymore. Because if this is true, if this grief is a structural necessity of human development, then I am not spiritually weak. I am just in transition. I am just growing up. Howard. You are in transition. You are grieving. And grieving is the most deeply human thing you can possibly do. It means you loved something, and now it is gone. Marcus Rachel. Held Evans wrote about this with such profound clarity in her book, Searching for Sunday, published in 2015. She explored the deep, agonizing grief of deconstruction within evangelical Christianity. She wrote extensively about mourning the community, mourning the familiar rituals, mourning the identity anchored in church life, even while fully recognizing that the institution had caused her deep, undeniable harm. She understood the complexity of missing the very thing that broke you. Adam. It really is a double grief, is it not? You lose the theology, the comforting certainty of what happens after you die, and you lose the people, the community right here on earth at the exact same time. Howard. A double grief. That is exactly the perfect phrase for it. Rachel gave a voice and a beautiful language to that very specific ache. We lost her in 2019 when she was only 37 years old, but her work, her honesty about missing the hymns, while totally rejecting the toxic dogma, it still holds so many of us together today. She made it okay to admit that leaving hurts. Marcus. And she is not the only one who documented this journey. There is also Reba Riley. She published a memoir called Post-Traumatic Church Syndrome in 2015. As a way to diagnose and heal from the severe spiritual wounds of her evangelical upbringing, she spent her 29th year visiting 30 different religious communities. Adam. 30 different churches in a single year? That sounds absolutely exhausting. Marcus. It was exhausting, and she documented the sheer disorientation, the physical symptoms of anxiety, the exhaustion that followed her deconstruction. But the most important part of her journey was the gradual realization that what she was experiencing had a recognizable pattern. It was not a unique curse placed upon her by an angry deity. It had a name, and once she named it, she could finally stop fighting herself and start to heal from it. Naming the trauma was the first step to dismantling its power. Adam. I entered this conversation with a terrifying certainty. I was certain that my pain was a judgment. I leave with a completely different clarity. My grief is just the heavy cost of building a self that is actually mine. It is an incredibly heavy cost. I still miss my friends. I still miss the certainty. But it is better than pretending. It is better than shrinking myself down to fit into a pew just to avoid the pain of growing up. Howard. And that is the absolute truth of it. You are allowed to miss the rituals. You are allowed to miss the comforting certainty of inherited faith. Missing those things does not mean you made the wrong choice. The grief is not a theological tether pulling you back to a doctrine you no longer believe. The grief is simply the bridge you must cross to finally meet yourself. Howard. If this conversation helped you put a name to the pain you have been carrying in silence for so long, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. Conversations like this are rare because the algorithm heavily favors quick anger and shallow debates over deep, structural healing. Your support helps us keep building this library of understanding. It proves that we are not alone in this journey and that our grief is valid. You are not just a spectator here. You are part of a new community of people who are brave enough to walk through the grief and ask the hard questions. Howard. I want to know exactly where you are in this process. Write the word bridge in the comments if that explanation of James Fowler's stages of faith completely changed how you view your own grief today. And tell me, what is the one specific thing you actually miss the most about your old religious community? Is it the singing? The potlucks? The certainty? Let us talk about it in the comments. The conversation continues down there. Howard. And remember, if you want to dig deeper into the historical evidence that started this whole process of deconstruction for me, check out the Spinoza Forever library in the pinned comment below. Take care of yourselves.